Less than 30 seconds now in regulation. Could this take extra time? 16 seconds. Here's Dyal. Send it up at the point, J. Lalu. Call midget now, but Matt, 6 seconds, 5, Dalfan coming out. He gets around him, 2 seconds. He's got to do it quick. Shoot the scores, 1 second left.
And we are back yet again for another stunning intellectual episode of the Faceoff.
Yes.
This is where you get all the top tier content, you know what I mean?
Yeah. The big
all
brain
the
stuff.
elite stuff. Yeah.
Mhm.
That's what you want. That's
It's
what
all-
everybody comes
all
here for, I
melamine
know.
here.
Yeah. It's kind of like the elite play recognition of podcasting.
Mm-hmm. It transferred extremely well.
Yes, yeah, 100%. 100%. Okay, so we're back. No guest with us this time, just myself and Mr. Tony Flo. So welcome back, Tony.
And all of the listeners who are always with us.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You know, it might be interesting to go back to live streaming these at some point.
Oh God. Yeah.
I mean, it was always kind
Yeah.
of not that we interacted with the chat a ton because there wasn't usually a ton of chat going on. But I know a lot of the times when Dick Doug and I would do this, it would be like, on a game night or something after the games would finish, we'd hop on and start chatting about things, and we'd have the Twitch chat open while people were playing in, all the post-game pubs and everything that used to happen and all that shit, right? So be something for them to listen to while they were playing, which was a good time. And we could sometimes get some input and questions from the chat, which was always kind of fun.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
So yeah, in theory, it would be neat. But when it's just like Guy, Austin, Goose, and maybe Juice, then
Yeah.
I don't know how much questions we'd get, so I don't really know what the point would be.
Yeah.
But
And Kiwi listens. Lewis friend.
true,
There's a
true.
couple.
I'm listing people that used to listen live,
Oh yeah.
and participate in the chat a little bit more. So
Yeah, I sure didn't. That was before my time, sort of, when the
I
face-off
mean,
was really
look, I
going.
wouldn't want to listen to Dick Doug try to tell me anything about the LHL or RSL anyway. So
He got it. That he understood, and he also played a whole lot of Crusader Kings with Panini. He had it all.
yeah,
Crusader Kings? I don't know. It was something they were always
whatever they
playing.
used to play. Yeah, I don't remember Hearts of Iron or I don't know, some
Oh,
fucking
yeah.
random
It's probably the
stupid
one where you
game.
can play as Nazis. That would make more sense.
Yeah, it would. It would. Okay, so we're here this time coming off of our discussion with Cap about a lot of the things that were difficult about being part of the BOC. Um, and we're moving on into something a little bit different, but kind of somewhat trending off of some of the conversations we had, which is more pertinent to player development. So, what are the sorts of things that, uh, happened that, or in this case, didn't happen, that contributed to the lack of player development, which I think is fair to say, right? We had pretty obvious issues with that throughout the course of not just LHL history, right? But this will really get into the RSL and JSL for the first time out of any of the discussions that we've had up to this point. So anyway, Tony, I know you have a lot of notes about this and a lot of strong
Yeah.
feelings about this, so I'll send it to your way to get started on this one.
Okay. Well, where do you want me to start here on the
Well,
just
I
kind of
mean,
my
I suppose.
overview on player development in general? Like I
Yeah,
could give
I
you.
suppose like, we'd give some
Yeah.
opening thoughts here, specifically highlighting, building off what we talked about last time, where we brought in the whole pub stars and LHL stars
Mhm.
discussions and the impact of that. You can go listen on previous episodes about some of that. We touched on, I think,
Yeah.
both of those already. So, but in general, just to recap, generally, neither of those were good for player development. We'll just
Yeah.
blanket
Well,
statement on that one.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I think there wasn't a whole lot that we did that was good for player development. Even the leagues, like I think in theory, it was like, okay, we got the junior league and we got the lower league, the minor league, and like there's places for people to play. And it definitely helped some, but I think there wasn't a whole lot of hands-on developing. And players, anybody who had any success in this game, whether they played JSL or RSL, at the end of the day, it came down to them putting the work in outside of the leagues to really improve. And like it could help. Like I think RSL play could train you for LHL play. There's like that would help. There is some development in the leagues, but for the most part, it all just came down to if you were going to get better, you had to play on your own and you had to work on things by yourself or with a group, just practice. And so yeah, development in the leagues and in pub stars and everything. It just I don't think this game gave the best environment to welcome either a new guy or somebody who's trying to make that next step.
No,
It,
it
it
never
really
did. It never did.
no.
And a lot of that just naturally comes down to the difficulty of the game, right?
Hmm.
And not just
Which is the
that.
fun of it too.
Well, absolutely, right? I mean, this is the
Yeah.
type of game that attracts hockey fans and attracts fans of games that challenge them and push them to, overcome obstacles and improve and get better. It's a really good game to sort of scratch that itch for people that like that. And unfortunately, it's not an easy game to get into because you can have a game that has that high skill cap and brings that level of challenge, but is still easy enough to start playing that you don't feel overwhelmed. But unfortunately, that was really just honestly never the never the case
Hmm.
with HQM, and was never going to be the case with HQM either, because part of the difficulty of the game is what makes it fun. And unfortunately, there's no good way to translate the like sort of challenge that comes with it into something that's a little bit more digestible and easy for somebody that's coming in for the first time. And that turns a lot of people off. And it also means that when you're coming in new behind people that have been playing the game for even a year or in some cases 5 years, you are so far behind what they're capable of. It becomes an extreme uphill battle just to get to the point of not being a negative to the team that you're on, right? So
Yep.
but anyway, so there were a number of different things that we attempted to do to try and sort of address the whole like newer player aspect of it, or players that weren't, LHL ready yet, right? So we got the obvious ones like the RSL and the JSL. But then we got some other smaller ones that were kind of, sprinkled in there here and there, like the NADT, which is something we can chat about. And also to a somewhat lesser extent, also, right, like the new player tournaments that went on, and
Yep.
even like the concept of Nub Stars, which didn't really get off the ground. So those are some of the tools that we had attempted as a community to implement to do it, but obviously, and as you'll get into here in a second, the sort of effectiveness of that is questionable at
Yeah.
best.
Hmm.
So, I mean, shall we start small? Like, should we start with the new player tournaments and Nub Stars? Seems like a,
Okay.
a good place to begin with the sort of lesser
Yeah,
impact
maybe what we
things.
tried to do with people who were brand spanking
Yeah,
new.
yeah. Um, so I think we talked about Nubstars a little bit, so I'll be quick on this one. But Nubstars was the Payne Gretzky edition version of Pubstars for purely new players. I thought that was a really good idea, but that requires a certain number of people to play to have games happen regularly, which I'm pretty sure is why it ended up dying out or not really catching on. If you don't retain enough
Yeah.
people for the JSL, you're gonna not, or you're gonna have a hard time retaining enough people to have Nubstars games happening frequently, which, I mean, that's what we saw happen, right? As we got towards the end, I think it was LHL season 18, when we finally got to a point where there wasn't enough people to even have a JSL anymore, and we had to cancel it, right? If I
Yeah.
remember correctly, that's what ended up happening there. So, it's kind of a death sentence to anything like that. But I think in theory, if that had been applied earlier along with pub stars, and we had actually been able to separate out earlier LHL stars and nub stars, right? You could have the RSL starters or RSL players are available for both, but beyond that, JSL players are available in nub stars and LHL players are available in pub stars, right? If you have like that kind of division there in the middle, I think that would have been a really good way of doing it. At least like during the season, right? Maybe during the off season, you could do everybody together in like a full pub stars thing. Um,
Yeah.
but I think that would have been a really good way of satisfying a lot of people by giving the LHL and upper tier RSL players a good environment to practice and not be worrying about having to carry along a new player or two new players or something like that and feeling like they're coming into a game already down a man. And it would have been really good for those newer players, sort of the backup RSLers and the JSLers that can't handle playing against the likes of the Juices of the world that are going to just smash them and the game's over 6-0 in the first period. Like what's the point? What do you gain from that?
Mhm.
So I think that could have been a really good concept to throw in there if it had worked in line with pub stars to create an environment that was a little more structured in that way. Obviously, that didn't pan out that way, and Nub Stars was a little late to the game anyway, so definitely didn't end
Could
up.
have used it in a different recruitment.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that would have been a really good way to get people to stay too, because Nub Stars was never available after a big player wave recruitment and being able to say that, oh, we have these ranked matches that you can play in, like that's yet another draw to potentially get people to stick around a little bit longer or put some effort in a little bit longer, which I think would have been a worthwhile addition. But anyway, so that's the nub stars element. Do you have anything on top of that?
For nub stars, not real. I was never really invested in it at that point. By the time that came around, I didn't think much of the idea of anybody up and coming through. Like it was like you said, you touched it was really late in the game.
Yeah.
Like that was near the end, and probably around that time was when we were already losing interest.
Mm. Okay,
But
so
yeah, it would have been
building
good.
building off of that, which the next thing I wanted to chat about, kind of we can do both at the same time, I suppose. But the new player tournaments was something that we had set up every time we had a recruitment. We would have a tournament expressly for people that were brand new to the game. I personally thought those were always successful. We had a tough
Yeah,
time still getting a lot of those people to then sign up for a league afterwards, or even in some cases show up to the new player tournament. But I think those were pretty exciting and a lot of fun. And I think all of those went well and did what they were supposed to do. The sort of turnout for them was always kind of tied to the turnout of the recruitment. So it's hard to judge exactly how much of a positive impact it had, but gut feeling is that it generally was pretty good. Um, the second one I wanted to get into is the NADT, since this was another kind of side project like the new player tournaments. They're kind of one-offs here or there.
yeah,
Um,
different level
yes,
of player
yes,
though.
yes, different level of player, but the NADT was something that Dalthan had set up originally to try and sort of bridge the gap between what you would get out of an LHL rostered player and an RSL rostered player. So the idea was to take some of the more, we'll call them exciting prospects, right? People that were in the RSL that maybe hadn't broken an LHL roster yet or were like the ninth guy on the team type thing, bringing them into uh, a roster that worked together and was built together to play against LHL teams. And that used to happen, I believe it was every night, right? I think it was every night that they played. But anyway,
Every LHL night.
used to happen after every LHL night. There would be one of the six teams would play against the NADT. And that's another one where I thought in concept I liked the idea of that, but in practice it wound up being a lot like what we've kind of talked about with some of the pub stars stuff, where you have just such a heavy imbalance between a team that is not LHL ready and a team that is. And even when you'd get to like the last place LHL team playing against the NADT, it still wouldn't be that much of a contest, unfortunately. So while I thought the idea in theory had some potential, in execution, it just wound up being them getting shit on a lot
Yeah.
and a lot of LHL teams not taking it seriously. And unfortunately, I think that really kind of undermined any potential that it had to really add much to their careers. So anyway,
Yeah.
okay. So shall we get into the RSL and the JSL? Start getting into the real meat of it.
Yeah, sure.
All
Maybe we
right,
could swing back to the NADT when we're talking about RSL players.
sure. Um, so you want to start in the JSL? Does that make more sense, or should we start in the
Yeah.
RSL and go
Well,
chronological? Because
well,
the
do you want
RSL
to,
came first.
you want to, yeah, I won't really have a great deal insight, but you should touch on the early RSL and its use.
Right. So the RSL came about actually kind of in lieu of a new player tournament. So it was the first recruitment wave that we had done since the LHL started. There was one right before the LHL, about a month before, which is where a lot of those names came from. If you go look at the season one draft
And
board,
which is why Lucic is a rookie compared to everybody else in season one.
correct.
Yeah.
And then you go to the end of that season, and we had done a second recruitment to try to get more people in, keep building up the numbers because we had enough to get, 1 6-team league. But Taze, who was the sole commissioner at the time, really wanted to push for, like, he wanted to get to a 32-team league. He wanted like a full, fleshed out thing. Obviously, eyes too big
I
for
mean,
his
yeah,
stomach
if you
type
don't know,
thing,
it's
right? But
ridiculous now, but that, like, back then when you think the sky's the limit,
yeah, I mean,
that's funny.
I don't blame him. He had come from again, like we spoke about before, right? He came from the VHL. He came from which is the EA NHL games, player-driven leagues that did have a GM for every single NHL team and like individual players that filled out all of those teams. I think the what isn't the EA SHL or something similar to
Yeah.
that now, right? So this predates that, but he came from an environment where that was a reality, and it was something that they did every couple months there was a new season or something like that. That's a lot of where the concept for the LHL came from. So he wanted to recreate that in an environment that gave you a more engaging experience being first player. So again, don't blame him at all for that, but unfortunately, I don't think he ever really appreciated the downsides of getting or of trying to get people into the game and the difficulties that would come from that. So anyway, we had a recruitment and we got enough people that it was going to be too much for a 6-team LHL league because you'd have way too many backups on each team. But all of these people that came in are brand new to the game. So they're not in a position to be like playing against LHL players. I mean, we had only started like 3 to 4 months prior, right? But it's still enough of a gap
Yeah,
where like we
that's a
can
gap.
skate around with the puck now. We can kind of shoot now. Some of us can pass and receive now versus being brand new. So we had started. I forget exactly what it was called. It was like Monday night showcase or something like that, where it was a once a week thing where it was basically like scheduled captains games almost between all the new guys is how it started, and that actually did well and caught on to the point where we wanted to make it into its own proper league, and so the Rising Stars League was born. And that was the RSL, and that started out as a 3v3 league due to the lack of people. And I believe it was 6 teams in the first season, might have been 4, but we started out by having them as joint teams with the LHL. So you would have an LHL GM and you would have an RSL GM. Or sorry, an LHL GM was responsible for this LHL team and the RSL team. So you'd have one big roster, and that
Yeah.
mixed feelings about how that went, right?
Yeah, and
But
that would probably go to show about kind of a lack of focus on development when you're running your LHL team and playing the games. You have so much to focus on with that that you don't. really have time for your RSL players and for these
Hmm.
new guys. And I'm sure in almost every instance of that there wasn't any help coming from above, and development wise for these new guys, that they were probably left to their own.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it and that was always a topic of discussion, which is something we can get into a little bit more as we get further into the RSL. But anyway, that's how the RSL started. That's where it came from. Eventually, it moved from 3v3 to 4v4, and then very shortly after that, eventually to 5v5 to mimic the LHL. Um, so that's kind of like a very brief overview of how that went about, how things started with the RSL. And you could go through and look at some of the early seasons of the RSL and find a number of names of players who ended up being meaningful LHL players. You've got the likes of like
Yeah.
Dalfan, Austin, Gabe got his start in the RSL a little
Leafs and
bit.
Cap.
Yeah, Leafs, Cap, Zam is another one.
Yeah, Jay
You
Lalu.
as well, Jay
Yeah.
Lalu, right? Like there's a number you can start pulling out there. Kiwi, I think, is another one. Um,
Marchi.
Yep, Marchi, Jerry. I mean, there's a lot of names
Yeah.
you can, pick out. So the
Yeah.
RSL
Especially when those
certainly,
early mid RSL days.
yeah, yeah. And I had done a look a little while back at people who played in the RSL that ended up being an LHL starter at some point, and that list is high 50s, I believe, like
Yeah.
56 to 58, somewhere in there, of people that got their start in the RSL and then ended up at some point by the end of the LHL had been a starter somewhere for a little bit. So it is a pretty, good list. But
Yeah.
the question that comes in with that is, okay, you played in the RSL, but did the RSL actually help develop you for that? Did it help set you up for the LHL, or was that something that you did and the RSL was just your environment to play in? And this is where I'm going to hand it over to you because I know
Yeah.
you have pretty strong opinions about that,
Yeah.
right?
And I went through I did kind of go through the gauntlet of the RSL, because that's, I came in and that was sort of I was in there for a while. Anyway, I saw a ton of guys kind of come up and through and pass me, and some guys come up and not, and guys who were there before me stay there, get worse, even get better sometimes. So it was, I don't know, it was really cool. And my main, I think I probably did well, I know I said it to you before this, but I don't remember if I touched on it when I did my little introduction on player development. But my sort of feelings are, for the most part in this game, whether the leagues are helpful or not, it was up to players on their own, uh, through no help of the league, to develop for the most part. And then it is true to a certain point, but like when it comes to me personally, I feel like I definitely benefited from playing in the RSL and learned, and I did get better, and I joined the RSL late. I'd been playing in pubs for months and months before I decided to join the league. So I was already ready. I was at a level where I was an effective RSLer right out of the gate pretty much. But I didn't really get a whole lot better, and I just kind of, if anybody knows my LHL career, it was a lot of sort of team play and being able to fit in wherever anybody wanted me to go, whether that's be a scorer, be a defensive forward, be a, you know, the primary breakout D man or the stay at home D man. So like I did it all, and that was a lot of just playing in the RSL and not getting much better on my own for a while.
Well, and you had
So
sort of an
yeah,
interesting trajectory too, where I'd say, and correct me if you feel this is wrong, but how many seasons did you spend in the RSL before you got to LHL? Was it 4?
6 through 10. Yeah.
So 5?
Yep.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Right.
Yep.
So during that time, I mean, you definitely improved, but I feel like you were sort of at your MVP level on Wubs, right?
Yeah. It was
But
early is the
right,
thing.
that's my point, right?
Yeah.
You were at your RSL MVP level in Wubs, and then it kind of feels like, and I'm just saying this, looking back at it statistically, but that there was almost a stagnation there for
Oh
you,
yeah.
where you
Yeah.
hit that point, and kind of like we spoke about before, you kind of hit a plateau, and I'm not sure what changed outside of the fact that the one season that Crab drafted you and decided to start you while Guy was gone. because you went from like a seventh round or sixth round draft pick as like a backup on an LHL team to starting on one in the span of about a season. And it was
Yeah.
absolutely the right choice. You killed it. You did super well. But it's kind of like, well, what changed in that time between you being an RSL MVP versus you leading the playoffs in
Yeah.
points, 4 or 5 seasons later in the LHL, right? Because there wasn't visible progress made until you hit the LHL.
Yeah. So that's the weird thing with, well, if we're talking about I think I had a strange development, and I think I'm a sort of different player. I was, at least when I came into the LHL, of in terms of other people who come up. Like most people who come up to the LHL are huge score, like they lead the RSL in scoring every season, and they're dangling, and they have all the talent, and they look too good for the RSL, if
The
in
the
quote
ones
too
that
good.
the ones that
Yeah,
move
the
up
ones that jump
quickly.
up. Yeah.
Yeah.
And with me, I think I was, well, I was never that. Didn't have hand. I didn't create a whole lot of my own offense. And I think, especially playing with lower tier players, it's hard to kind of show off as a team player. Like the only real way I think people would know is looking at points. And I wasn't really a great scorer outside of one season in the RSL. Like I was always a top performer, but I was only ever the league leader once, in my second season on Wilkes-Barre. And then, yeah, I'm not really sure. It's just I feel like I always kind of, I think I was, even on Cleveland. I think I was the same player on Cleveland that I was probably the season before in the RSL, and where that whole LHL season I was on, the Chicago's team bench, and I'd never played once, and I don't even think it was like a crazy decision or anything. I'm not like, oh, I should have been played. It's just I think, I think I would have fit in somewhere. I think a team had a use for me, but I think I was always passed up for the flashier players who don't always work out. Where I did, because even though I'm not as skilled and I didn't look as good in the RSL, I was better suited to the LHL game than them, because I guess they're used to being the number one guy. Like all these players come up. If you lead the league in scoring in the RSL, you come up and you tend to try to play that same way. You try to be the scorer, and that's not really, even though I was scoring on Cleveland, that's not what I was trying to do. I was trying to back check and pass and be an all around, effective player.
Yeah, which translates a lot more, right? Like you said,
Yeah.
because typically when you make the move up from the RSL to the LHL, you're coming in as like, the second defenseman on the team or the
Hmm.
second forward on the team. And in a lot of those cases, the number one guy in front of you is very likely to be, a more established player already
Yeah.
that in a lot of cases, especially as a forward in your case, right, is going to be one of the more offensively uh, dominant players, right? So you're getting drafted to play alongside the likes of like Lucic or something like that
Yeah.
instead of playing alongside of, somebody who's a passing forward or a secondary forward themselves. So I think making that adjustment and sort of, accepting that you not only do you not have the skill set yet to be the guy on the team, like or the elite player on the team, the carry, right? You
Yeah.
also aren't going to be given the position to do that, and that's really tough to sort of overcome and break
Yeah.
that
That too.
mentality. And I think that, in all honesty, hurt a number of people. I think, just to call out one in particular, I think that hurt KP for a while early on in his career, where, KP was always, he actually started in the JSL, but still moved up to the or RSL very quickly. And it was clear that he had a lot of talent and a lot of ability. But when it came to playing in the LHL early on in his career, he never really looked very good when he was doing it. And I think that's a lot of the reason why, because he came in with the, mentality of, oh, I'm like the superstar in the league, right? And
Yeah.
I'm not saying he believed that he was the superstar of the
No,
LHL
that's
at
how
that
he
point.
played. That was his
But
entire career to
exactly,
that point, is
that's
that. And it's
that's
not
the
just him.
way
It's yeah,
that's the way he came into the game. That's the way he played the game on the ice, even if that's not what he believed. And that play style for him, exposing the RSL and playing against the RSL in such a dominant fashion is not the way to play against the LHL in a dominant fashion. It's not the way
yeah,
to be an elite tier LHL forward. So I think he had a lot of trouble breaking some of those habits.
yeah,
You know, where the board deke meme came from, right? He had a lot of trouble breaking those habits and being able to retool his game to fit what the LHL style was, which the
yeah,
LHL style is a lot less forgiving in terms of making mistakes or making people look stupid, right? Those
yeah,
types of things don't happen anywhere near as much. People are a lot more positionally responsible. They're not clumping up as much. They are a lot better at playing one-on-one defense or skating alongside you and forcing pressure on you. And being able to adjust to all of that it's a big leap to take, and especially for somebody who excelled at all of the easy things that we didn't touch on here, right, against the lesser competition. So anyway, it's a bit of a side tangent, but we'll
yeah.
let you carry
Eh,
on.
Well, yeah, and well, you're right though about um it's a great point of all the really good RSLers for the most part got basically almost forced, but I mean forced by their own ability into being the number one guy for the entire duration of their junior career or their
Yeah,
minor career. And my theory on the game really and how I approached the LHL was, I was always trying to facilitate the star players like you. Like I would always play D for you, and I wouldn't even question. I wouldn't play D for everybody, but I would play D for you, and I would try to run the plays through you and things like that. But where other RSL high scorers, they never had to do that in the RSL. They did it all themselves, and there'd be such a struggle for them there. And instead of just and there's no real spot either. Another I think a problem a lot of like the RSL dangler style players had, unless they like a few of them became good, but for the most part, like in the LHL, there's 12 starting forward spots,
in
and
total.
that's it. Like that's all there's room for. And for the majority of the LHL, I wrote a list here. If you let me go through,
Yeah,
I
go
think
for it.
I have 12 players here of and one of them was only a couple seasons, but for the most part, there's you, Dyal KS Auto, DMB, Crab, Lucic, Gabe, Dildozer, Matt, Timu Solani. There's 9. And you get Tall and Cap, who are always playing. And they're kind of at a different one. And Jay Lalu is another guy who was a dominant player in his short time playing. But so right there is 12 players. There's 11 spots if you don't count Lalu, who didn't play as much as the others, but there's some really high end players on that, except for Tall and Cap, who were good and they were really good
Oh, and you're
LHLers at
not counting
points.
yourself in that either. I know you played a lot of
No,
defense, but still, like
yeah,
that's
no,
that's another
I'm
one of
saying
those
even when
forward
this is like
slots.
when I joined, these are who I'm looking. These are like
The
who
people
needs to
above
be
you.
jumped,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
if I think the reason why I succeed, like Tall and Cap, have spots that were carved into the LHL, and they would always have a spot because they're like me. They play that secondary role better, and so. But
Well,
when
they
you're
were they
looking
were
at being a
established secondary
yeah,
forwards
yeah,
already. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Uh, But these RSL scorers come up. If you're not scoring more than any of those get Dial, Auto, DMB, Lucic, and Timu, even and Gabe, like these really high scoring players, it's a waste to use you. It's not good enough. If you come into the league and you're playing like a number one and you're putting up under 2 points a game, you're not going to win. Your star player needs to be putting up 2 to 3 in that range points per game. And
We'll say
there
two to
were,
two and a half to be fair,
yeah,
because three
yeah,
three is
three is up there, but
three
I'm
is
saying
pushing
in
it.
that
But yeah,
above 2, it needs to be above 2.
yeah.
Your number one player needs to be putting up, or you're not going to win. And there were like, 10 players that could do that consistently. and like you Otto, DMB, and Lucic especially, and like I'm not even like counting in there some of those other like Timo would score a lot, even though he wasn't so much a winner. He's more of a problem. He's more of a guy who probably, like those RSL guys, was too focused on scoring when he wasn't quite good enough. But even then, like those RSL scorers were nowhere near Timu's level. Like Timu was on another level than like I'm just trying to like crack pipe, drag even like guys who played in the LHL with drag and Ike and Quacky Face, like the guys who would lead the RSL when they were playing. And there's more back in my time, like afterwards I don't know who was dominating, but these guys they're a step below Timu, and Timu was like a lower end, you know, player in terms of compared to you and Otto and DMB and Lucic. Like he couldn't even compete with that. So like I think people had to set a bar, and if they couldn't hit it, they really needed, which it didn't really happen a lot, but they needed to change their game. Like somebody who absolutely just played the right way when he couldn't, he couldn't score like you guys, but he played just a good game,
Well,
and
to
he carved his own way.
agreed, and to touch on your point earlier about not being worth playing if you're under 2 points a game, right? I know I'm a little late on that, but I just verifying
Yeah,
that in the background. There is one team ever that won a cup without a player in the regular season who was below 2 points per game. So that was only season 14 New York, who had DMB at,
13.
or sorry, 13 New York, who had DMB
Yeah,
at 1.83 points per game.
yeah.
Every
And I
other
know he was
cup,
over 2 in the
he
playoffs.
was over 2 in the playoffs, and every other two, well, he was actually at 2 in the playoffs,
Ah,
so close. Anyway,
close.
every other team that won a cup had at least one player who was at 2 points per game or higher. So it just kind of goes to show you that if you don't have your star player being able to put up points consistently, you're going to have a
Yeah,
really hard time winning the game or
yeah,
winning the season. I mean, really, really hard time. And that team is almost an exception because I'd honestly say that Nashville choked that season, won,
yeah,
and like they lost it more than New York won it. But at the same time, New York was also a heavily
yeah.
defensively oriented team,
Yeah,
so they
and
at
they got
least
well, and they made an addition with TB at the deadline. They changed their structure, like so the
right,
early season could be disregarded, like
right.
their struggles early on.
Right, but they had Tays, Austin, and Cap
Hmm.
defensively, and Meets Hill and net. I mean, that's an incredibly good back end to be, building on top of. So anyway, just wanted to make that point to sort of reinforce yours.
Yeah, it's that yeah that was always something I thought about those high scoring RSLers that I never understood. If they complained about not playing LHL, I would never get it. Like you would that's not the role. Like none of them fit that role. Like they might come in and have a little bit. Like I saw players come into the LHL a lot, and they would score some points, and it would be better than you'd think, right? Like I'm sure. I'm just trying to think of an example, but
Drag
they're
maybe?
all blank right now. But
Drag?
there were drag at least he had I would say he was an LHLer though. But he's similar, and people, especially people who played like drag but were worse, but up to that level of like yeah, he comes in and he
Because like,
plays like a number one, and he's just
I
a
mean,
team
did
with
he?
him as your number one isn't good enough. I'm saying he
Well, that's
plays like one.
okay. Okay, I
He
see
would
what you mean. I see
yeah,
what you mean. Like that's his play
that's the
style.
yeah
Not he played as well as a number one. But yeah,
no
no, no. I agree. I agree completely.
yeah, but I mean there were players who would come in and play a handful of games, and they would score a bunch in them. Rezzy's a guy who would score a good deal in the LHL, but again,
Self
he
plug.
plays like a number one. He doesn't do enough. It's nowhere near enough, to
What
be
what about the
to
self
warrant that.
plugs of the world?
Yeah, the self plugs of the world. Another guy who he could
Hawk.
score like crazy. Yeah, these guys. Well, Hawk is a good example of somebody who could come in and score in the LHL. Like he would put up points in the LHL, but he had so many flaws in his game, especially on the two-way side of
Hawk
things.
Hawk has to be one of the most disappointing careers out of anybody for me.
Yeah, because
mostly
you
because of
thought he was going to
how.
be good.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, because he demonstrated an ability in the RSL to not only score but be a good team player as well. I mean, like you
Yeah, put
said,
up assists in the
he
RSL.
he lacked a lot of the defensive side of the game, which as a secondary forward you kind of have to have. It's almost like an unwritten rule, really, as a
Hmm.
secondary forward, where you need to be able to play defensively so that you can give extra space to the offensive, partner that you're working with, which is typically one of the better goal scorers, right? You want them to be
Yeah,
able to take advantage of open ice and breakout passes and whatnot. So kind of by default, you're forced to play more defensively. But Hawk had the toolkit to be just as good as you, or fill a very
oh yeah,
similar set of shoes
better
as what
scorer
you
than I
did.
was.
He was a very prolific
Yeah,
scorer, despite still being a good passer, a playmaker. And I really thought that he had everything he needed to be like a really effective LHL player. And not only did the toxicity and awful, awful mentality that he has completely ruin it for me, but he really struggled to make that work on an LHL level. And I never really understood that. I mean, he had like one
yeah,
good season, I think, where he was putting up around 2-ish points per game. Playing like almost halftime on like one of the Toronto teams or something. I'm
yeah,
forgetting off the top of my head here, but um, so he showed flashes, but he never really put it together on a consistent basis. And unfortunately, it got to the point where people disliked him so much, and he was so much of a fucking edge lord that he stopped
yeah,
getting given chances, and that was it. So Hawk's got to
yeah,
be one of the most disappointing prospects for me in terms of potential to end result. But
yeah. And I can't, I can't really think of anybody that I was super high on that didn't quite make it, and didn't or kind of let me down. It's, I don't know. It's such a weird little. There's so many little players here and there that maybe have a season where it makes you go, okay, maybe they could.
yeah, we can
But
go through some of them at the end,
yeah,
maybe individually, to kind of walk through some of the success stories, or I guess not success stories.
yeah, a
Um,
lot of not success stories, but those wouldn't really be worth touching on. There's
yeah.
there's a lot of them.
So, okay.
But yeah, probably. You know what? I wonder if RSL defense, like, it must be more defensemen from the RSL made it eventually. Like, it must be such a skewed. Like, even legendary Trev
Well,
played a,
so
a good
so
meaningful number of
so this kind
LHL
of leads
games on
into
D.
what I wanted to go into, which is, you talked about the number of forward spots only being 12, and the names that you're looking at having to replace or be better than, right? We already established that that's a really fucking hard thing to do. You're looking at probably maybe
Yeah,
2 to 3 potential spots every season where you could come in and be a starter. And not have to take one away from one of those other, like, top 9 or so guys that you listed. So very competitive to that aspect. Going off of that, do you believe that we should have made more of an effort to make more LHL teams to get more starting offensive spots to try to build that talent out a little bit more?
uh, I think there was a time to do it. I'm sure at one point could have jumped to 8, but I don't know. It's weird. I don't think I really ever oversaw a time in the LHL where I thought, or as BOC, sorry, where I thought there's a whole lot of guys that need spots. Like, there were a couple here and there that I thought could play a minor role, but I don't know. Well, like I said, like, we were just talking about the 2 points per game rule, sort of you're not going to win without an insane high scoring forward. I don't think there would have been enough of them to go around.
No, there wouldn't have been.
There would have been
A-
like two competitive teams in an 8-team league.
and the talent would have been really diluted, which was
Hmm.
what we ran into when we did 8 team leagues and 4v4. Was basically like the bottom 3 teams pretty much were utter garbage. Both seasons
Yeah,
that we did it, they were like almost entirely non-competitive. And
there
one
was
of
always a
those,
6-team and 6-team leagues
right,
too. That
yes, there
you
was
know,
always one bad team. Sometimes there were 2 that were really bad. But you get to the point of having like now it's two guaranteed and sometimes even three that were, just like, well, time to go get 5 points tonight and inflate my points on the season,
Yeah.
right? Like there were too many of those teams and those games. And as we've touched on, again in previous episodes, right? When you dilute the talent so much, you make each of those superstar players that much more important, and it
Mhm.
gives them that much more ability to dominate a game. And I don't think that that's a good thing. And I think most people would agree that that's not a good thing, because then it becomes all about having that or not having that. And if you
Yeah.
have
And
it,
how
you have
many
a chance
players
to
are there
win.
that could give you that too?
Exactly. If you have it, you have a chance to win. If you don't, guess what? You're not going to win. Sorry. Like,
Yeah.
can't do anything about it. And the shitty situation that comes with that too is there's no good way to acquire it, right? There's no way to sort of develop a forward like a Kill Pessel and bring him up and turn him into your superstar forward.
Yeah.
There's no good
It's
way
you
to,
either have it or you don't, pretty
yeah,
much.
there's no good way to
With the
trade for one.
exception of
You can't
juice.
sign one, right?
Yeah.
So I think that was always a downside, but probably the time to have moved to 8 teams was when we had our or shortly after we had our really big influx of guys around season 8. So
Yeah.
probably around like season 10 to 12, that would have been the time frame I think where we could have had 8 teams. But like you said, it's almost adding two more teams that are guaranteed to be shitty, and you're
Yeah.
still going to have two more top teams. So, from a league balance perspective, it definitely wasn't one that would have made the season more competitive. But from a player development perspective, I can certainly see the argument to say that that could have made a big difference in giving those guys opportunities where they, as we talked about with offense, wouldn't have had them to begin
Yeah.
with. On the defensive side of things, though, it was a little bit different there. Those who played the LHL for a long time will probably know that there's been a lot of defensive turnover throughout LHL history. You have a couple of your mainstays that were, prevalent throughout the entirety of the LHL, or large portions of it anyway, that took up those defensive slots. You can look at guys like Marchie towards the end, Austin towards the end, but BG, Taze, Dalfan, you can throw in Go Leafs
Leafs.
Go,
Mhm.
Zam as well, right? People that are kind of established number one LHL defensemen. Well, if you notice, that list is not really the same length of the forward list, right?
Star
And
forward list. Yeah.
exactly. And some of those are people that started their career later. Some of those are people that took large breaks in their career and weren't playing. Some of those players also played offense for a while. So even that's not a truly comprehensive list of names that match the, KS Autos of the world, right? To that aspect, if you're trying to pair them together, it's really just Taser that fits that, because
Yep.
Leafs and Zam and BG and Delph, all of them probably played closer to, 8 to 9 seasons on defense, maybe at most, whereas Taze is at, 19.
Yeah.
So um, i it's not the same length of career to draw from. So in any given season where you have, 12 starting defensive slots, just like you have 12 starting forward slots, you're looking at a lot more opportunities to get involved, because you don't even have enough number one defensemen to go around. At least with the superstar forwards, you typically had enough where every team had somebody who was
That
capable
could
of putting
score
up
and
two
keep the
points a
game
game.
competitive.
Yeah, to various degrees, obviously, right? But still, you had, enough people that, or at least one person on every team that could get like, a goal and an assist per game or something, right? But defense, most seasons, or at a lot of seasons, you really only had like 3 people that were capable of being a number one defenseman, like
Mhm.
bona fide number one, no question about it. And beyond that, you had now 9 more slots to fill in with people that can't match that. And I think, in all honesty, the gap between the superstar forwards and the next tier of forwards was never as big as the gap between the superstar defenseman and the next defenseman following them, which, in
Mhm.
my opinion, made it really hard to fill those shoes effectively.
Yeah,
I don't know if you want
definitely.
to touch on that more, but
Well,
so
yeah,
it kind of builds off the point you said earlier, right? About, there's only two or three forward slots. Well, now there's, 8 to 9 defensive slots,
yeah,
but
uh,
nobody wants to play defense.
yeah.
Everybody wants to be the scorer.
The
Everybody
score.
wants to be on offense. And I
Yes,
think,
so many players, so many good, talented players just wouldn't do it
yep,
and
and
never learned it. Never learned the basics of team play and defense that they couldn't even slot in on D.
and I think the RSL, for as bad as it was for teaching bad habits to RSL forwards, who then couldn't break those at the LHL level, it teaches really bad habits to RSL defensemen too, because they're practicing against people that are doing all those dumb things like board dekes,
Yeah.
and they're practicing against people that half the time can't shoot the puck properly or handle the puck properly and deke around somebody or make a good pass and play positionally well enough to have to worry about a centering pass. A lot of times those weren't things that came into play, so having to then step up to an LHL level and play against that in a much more structured environment that is way less forgiving to your mistakes is really challenging to fill that. And I think as a result, there were a lot of defensemen that kind of fizzled out when they got to the LHL, despite looking good at an RSL level. And we can take a look at some guys like Legendary Trev for that, or Johnny Hockey was another one who was really good, came up and then could never quite cut it all the way, right? Dick Dug, it
Mhm.
was kind of the same thing earlier on anyway, into his career. So there's a number of people who really struggled to kind of bridge that gap, but it makes sense when you break it down that way, at least to me. So
Yeah. Yeah, there's man. Yeah, there's a whole lot of guys that just oh, I wonder if with a little better development what some of those guys could have done. I mean, well, if you want to get into the NADT a little more, like Legendary Trev's a guy who I think Dalf was super high on and thought
yep,
he could turn him into an LHL defenseman because he had some hands, he had some talent. He just didn't play D particularly well.
yeah,
And like as much effort as you put in like maybe a season's worth of trying to teach him. I mean, it's more play style and habits than anything that that he'd already developed, and he would have to
yeah.
just reinvent his game to
So so the question that comes along with that, right, is what do you do differently? What could
yeah,
have been done to provide somebody like Trev the opportunity to do that? Because unfortunately, the way the structure of our leagues worked, it was basically like, you play against RSL talent, and then at some point to move up to the LHL, you're effectively just thrown to the wolves in a game at some point, and just said, okay, go ahead, you got to figure it out now. You got to be able to take that leap, and that's a really hard thing to do. That just like in real life, right? People have different development times, right? You get NHL prospects that sometimes don't pan out till they're like 25, 26 and have been playing against professionals for, 8 years, right? But in the LHL, the average life cycle of, somebody's opportunity to start and be good and demonstrate that they're good in a lot of cases was only like 1 season or 2 seasons. Like Legendary Trev, I think had 1 season as a starter where he was given a full season to play alongside Taze,
yeah,
and that went well at the start, but as it kind of fizzled out and as he kind of got exposed more, he kind of lost that opportunity and never got it back again. And
yeah,
that gives such a small window, especially as a defenseman, to be able to demonstrate that you can figure it out and that you can improve and make progress. And, you know, I I'll be honest when I say I'm not sure how much could have been done to fix that, because you look at the NADT, and yes, that is a good attempt at doing something. But when you're basically creating a team of RSL All-Stars versus an LHL team and they lose every time and get blown out every time, even when the LHL teams aren't even playing seriously, it
using
really
backups.
it really devalues the worth of that and
Mhm.
makes it it makes it look even worse, right? You're playing against
Yeah.
LHL backups that are half the time out of position. You get people like forwards, superstar forwards playing goalie and shit, and they're still winning. It's like,
Yeah. Well,
very
those are the RSL
demotivating.
teams again. If you don't have that scorer, if you don't have the stars, which you don't at that RSL, even the best in the RSL are not that level that is needed to
So,
compete at and win
so
LHL games.
in my opinion, the only thing that I think could have been done differently was if the NADT team for the night, whatever that team was, because Dalthan used to set lineups before the game and whatnot, was merged with the LHL team that they were facing and did like a split scrimmage where you'd take
Yeah,
half the starters of the LHL team, maybe like, the number one defenseman, secondary forward, and the number one forward, secondary defenseman, put them on one team, fill the rest of the slots with the NADT, take the others, put them on the other team, fill the rest of the slots with the NADT. And I
yeah,
wouldn't
that could
even
have been good.
use the LHL goalie at that point, just take two NADT goalies and put them on both sides. That I
Yeah,
think
that could have
would
worked.
have that would have given them an environment where at least the game has potential to be a lot more competitive, and playing with LHLers, they'll actually start to learn some things from playing alongside them, like seeing, oh, especially in this case, right, where I'm thinking in theory, you know, let's have an NADT team playing with myself. We'll look at season 10, right, as an example. So I'm a number one forward. And let's see who is on the NADT. It's on offense. I'm not Stamkos. Is somebody that could have been a good secondary forward in that case, right? So imagine pairing him with me, and then on the other side, you get Cap with Drag. Now
Yeah,
Drag gets to play with a supporting forward that understands how facilitate the play offensively to the scorer, and he would have also gotten Dalfan, who is a good breakout passer, to help get him into open space and play well defensively behind him to give him the freedom to do what he wants. And then on the flip side of it, you've got Stamkos learning how to position himself properly as a secondary forward to accompany a number one forward who could, demonstrate like, okay, this is where you need to be able to make a nice centering pass, or this is where you need to be when we're, forechecking so you can play off me, right? Little things like that that I think would have gone a long way to helping them sort of figure out the differences between the RSL play style.
yeah.
So I think
But
that could have
well,
been a good way to do it, but
uh,
even that's not a guarantee.
yeah,
So
and I wonder how much like it is so even though you're playing every game night or whatever well not everybody but I guess everybody would in this case because there's two teams but it seems like how much can you really gain from that amount of time and in these instances and different teams and sometimes playing with the bad teams and there's players in the LHL who could there were a lot of them who could teach you bad tendencies playing with the Boston team is a really that's a good example because there's a that is a very well built team with a lot of good players that fit well and played their role
yeah.
effectively but not not every team had that especially the non-playoff teams, even the middling fourth seed level teams, and it's and drag somebody well for drag for example, playing the
At the
number one
at the
spot,
same
playing
time
with
though,
Cap. He want like that's I feel like that's not what he need. Like drag needed to become a more two-way guy, which he had nothing. Like he had nothing defensively in the tank there, which is kind of why he wasn't very effective in the LHL. Even though he could put up some points, it wasn't enough. You know, like I, I don't think he needed any. He didn't need any help scoring. I think that was his peak. Like he could score, not quite at the level that he needed to play how he did. I think a lot of players to hit the next level need they really needed to play differently. Like the skilled players just needed to be play smarter and play. And I'm not sure how you really teach like Dalf. He's got his videos there and he's got his coaching, which I assume he did on NADT.
oh, I did a
But
lot of it.
yeah,
And
but other than that, like that seems like the only thing that could really help a lot of these guys to get to the next level.
as much
Just
as I think the whole, videos and PowerPoint thing is a meme, I do genuinely believe that, especially at that point in time, Delph was doing a lot of good things in terms of like being a successful like coach in that environment. And I do think a lot of the things he was teaching those players was beneficial. Like taught me to be a better player as well. I mean, like
Mhm.
he had a lot of value to add that goes beyond the memes that people kind of throw at him these days. So
Videos.
I think that's about as good of an environment from a coaching perspective as what you could get. I think maybe adding Crab into the mix as well, although I think Crab knows a lot, but I don't think Crab was as good of being like an active coach and saying like, here are the things that you need to work on. Like
It's
let's
kind of like
sit
Wayne
down.
Gretzky,
Yeah, like let's
coaching on Phoenix. It's like, some people just don't see the game on the level of Crab, which I don't even. Talf didn't either. I don't think anybody sees the game like Crab did.
no, Crab had a very unique
There's a
way of seeing
difference
the
between,
game. And again, you can
coaching and
learn a
tactics
fuckload from
versus,
Crab.
yeah.
Crab is one of the most complete,
Oh yeah.
well-rounded players in LHL history. He's amazing. Amazing player. An amazing GM too. But
Mhm.
I don't think he ever possessed the same, I don't want to say willingness because that's not fair, but same ability to like sit down with somebody, go through a replay with them, and be able to say like play by play, like, okay, look, this is a decision you made here, but let's like, let's pause this, take a look. You made this decision when you could have gone here instead, and here's why. And I think Crab is a little more brief with it, maybe a little less descriptive, maybe a little more blunt, and just saying like, oh well, you should have passed it around. And it's like, I mean, he's right, but at the same time, I don't think you get the same understanding from it because there's a difference between just knowing when you're wrong and knowing why you're wrong. And I think a lot of the players that struggled to make it in the LHL never really grasped the idea of why they were wrong to be doing the things that they were doing. So I think that was really the key difference or the lack in mentality that they had that was the separation between those people and people like Guy that did end
Yeah.
up making it and turned out to be really good players. So, um, but anyway, I would be interested to see an NADT like that where you're doing kind of like a split thing. I think that obviously now doesn't matter as much.
Yeah,
Um,
unless we did a crazy recruitment.
yeah,
But
but back then I think that would have made it a lot better. And I think the LHL players would have taken it a little bit more seriously at that point too. And like you said, not all of them are going to be great teachers or great to play with, but you kind of don't really have a choice with that. And in a way, it's good for them to know how to play with all kinds of players that they could
yeah,
potentially be alongside in the
you don't always
LHL
get on
anyway.
Dial's team
Well, yeah, you don't always get on a good team,
unless you're
and
me.
you're
I
not
was always
always
on good teams.
you're not always playing with people that are going to play, the best way they should be, and learning how to play around that is a good thing. And if anything, it can serve as a reinforcement to, these are the bad habits I need to not do, or
Mhm.
these are the situations that get me and my team in trouble, and things that I can avoid when I'm an LHL starter full time. So anyway,
Yeah,
okay.
that definitely wasn't ever put in anybody's head what I ever saw in the RSL. That's something that, well, just from my own experience, there was no learning from your mistakes there. I mean, unless you were doing it on your own, like unless you thought, okay, I shouldn't do this anymore, and don't. But like
It
nobody ever talked about it. There wasn't really any coaching, developing going on,
it kind
even
of
amongst
makes
the
me
players.
it kind of makes me wish that we had another chance to go back and redo the RSL. And by that I mean the season that you and I GM'd together, because looking back on it now, I would have loved to, or I would at this point love to go back and try to focus more on setting up our like top level players, like the guys like Java and whatnot that were playing really well and helping to carry us, and try to work with them on things that could help them be better LHL players. And then for the backups, like the Barnold and like Beefings and some of those guys, right? Work with them on the things that could make them more successful in the RSL. I think if we had focused a bit more on those individual players and trying to improve them and coach them a bit more, we could have made we could have at least attempted to make a better difference in terms of what their ultimate development ended up looking like. But this kind of gets into the next topic that I want to discuss regarding the RSL, which is the situation with GMs, assuming that you've covered everything you want to up to now.
Yeah.
Okay, so the RSL kind of bounced a bit back and forth in its early history between having affiliations with the LHL and, as such, one GM for both the LHL and RSL teams, and not having affiliations. Ultimately, the non affiliated teams ended up winning out. That was the preferred situation. And a lot of that was because the LHL teams that were, or the LHL GM that was responsible for the RSL team typically would not even show up to the games, not really provide much input, not really.
I know Hattrick had to make the lines and do everything. He
Yep,
played as
yep,
tour coach one season. That's when I joined the game, and I
yep.
would see him around in that name, and then
It,
talking to him about it. He had to do it. He had a bunch of defensemen that he had to work how to play these guys. Like he
yep.
had a team of 4 D-men.
So a lot of these situations, or a lot of these teams, it was the same situation, right? Where ultimately you almost get sort of like a captain that ends up being the one in charge or responsible for trying to coordinate the team, make scrims, like all the things that you get out of a typical LHL GM, you weren't getting in the RSL. So I can definitely understand why people wanted it to go their separate ways. We did explore the opportunity of still having affiliated teams, but having a separate predetermined RSL GM that was associated with the LHL team, and would be responsible for doing those things instead of that LHL GM. But that became a little bit difficult because then if they're affiliated, that means the LHL team is the one drafting all the players, which means the RSL GM doesn't get a say in his team composition, which is a
Hmm.
big demotivator for them because then it's almost like not even their team. Plus, if it's a predetermined thing, then that predetermined player would have to either be already on the LHL roster from the start or drafted by that GM. So there was like a whole bunch of complexities that came into it. Um, but anyway, so obviously that wasn't good, right? So we ended up getting to the point of RSL specific GMs. But even when we did that, I feel like there was still a lot of trying to think of the best way to describe it. A lot of the RSL GMs were still lacking in what they needed to bring to the table to make their RSL team successful. Yes, they were there more frequently. Yes, they were like, helping set up scrims and they would actually, run the team, like pick up free agents and whatnot. And, they were focused on making their team successful, not making their LHL team successful. So, that was all positive. But I feel like a lot of the people that were brought in, and I'm, referring to them as people, um,
I
didn't
would hope so.
really didn't really fill that role very well, and didn't really do a great job of helping to develop anything. And I think in a lot of those cases, it was kind of
Yep.
like, well, like they're there for the game, and then the game's over and everybody leaves, and it's kind of like, well, okay, you know, cool, but did you develop anybody? Did you coach anybody? Did you try to resolve issues in anybody's game? Or did you just say, oh, we'll get them next time. See you guys on Wednesday?
Yeah.
Because that doesn't help.
Yeah.
And
You know, Monty, when I joined, Monty was my first GM, and he did a pretty good job, honestly, of making sure everybody played and getting people into positions and trying to play them the right way. And I always really appreciated that about his GMing. I was really fortunate because I know a lot of players didn't really get that. It was a lot of they get people who were kind of doing it out of necessity, or people who wanted to play with their friends, so they would build certain teams, and what that wasn't great for developing, others and backups and lower end players on the team.
I mean, I think honestly, the mentality of most players and GMs in the RSL was bad. I think a,
Yeah.
a lot of people weren't focused on, like, a lot of people would say they wanted to improve and were trying to get better, but they wouldn't actually do much
Yeah, they
to
wouldn't put in the
show
effort.
that. Yeah, like there's a difference between saying it and actually doing something. There's a difference between wanting it and doing something. And I think a lot of people kind of hoped that they would get better and they would be better. But the reality is, in a game like this, where everything you do and every success or failure you have is entirely dependent on your ability, and that alone, you can't just kind of play the game and sit back and hope to get better. You have to be
Hmm.
actively working on things. And that means things like sitting in a solo server practicing stick handling, or sitting in a server with your goalie practicing taking shots, or sitting in a server with your offensive teammate practicing passing back and forth, or even sitting in a server with a defenseman and practicing breakout passes. These are all things that you have to do and make an effort to do. And you could still work on those things in pub games and in real games too. I'm not saying you can't, right? But you
Yeah.
need to make an active effort to be going out of your way to work on things that first identify the things you're not good at and then work on those things instead of just being like, oh, well, I'm just going to, play to my strengths. I'm just going to be a pure goal scorer and not do anything else.
Yeah, I
So
think passing practice is something that definitely helped me a
a
lot,
lot
which I was
a
doing,
lot of
yeah, when
people
I
should have done that more.
got into when I first starting.
Yeah. So I think that whole mentality needed to break. And if you didn't break that, the only way you were getting into the LHL would have been by default because there weren't enough LHLers at your position above you,
Yeah, which
which
is
did
kind of what
happen,
happened in
which did
season. Well,
happen.
that's honestly why
Yeah.
I got in. It's just the reason why I stuck around
No, that,
versus those other guys who went in the third and fourth round who fizzled out and didn't start. Some
yeah.
of them never started again, and that's just like kind of putting in the work, honestly.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
So that about does it for me on the RSL. Shall we jump to the LHL? Or sorry, the
LHL.
JSL?
Wrong way, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Let's jump right into everybody's favorite league.
Okay.
Never controversial.
Um, a lot of people wanted to kill the JSL earlier.
Yeah.
I thought the JSL served the purpose that it needed to at the start. But what ultimately ended up happening was like the JSL was meant to be a place that you'd spend at most like 2 to 3 seasons where you're really just there while you're learning how like the base mechanics of the game work. And once you know how to like, stick handle, and I'm not saying deke, right? But like
Yeah.
skate with a puck. Once you learn how to take a shot, once you learn how to start receiving some passes and making some passes, you move up to the RSL, you become an RSL backup, then a starter, and you keep going. What the JSL turned into was basically a haven for people that didn't give a shit at all
Yeah.
and just were like not good enough to start in the RSL. So they would just fuck around in the JSL the whole time. And it definitely got to a point where, we had some people that spent 5 seasons in the JSL.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it suffered from a lot of the same problems that the RSL did, where, the mentality is obviously shit.
There's no
The
guidance.
Exactly. The JSL and the RSL had their own, affiliation, non-affiliation things that went on. Same thing as LHL and RSL. And you still had the same problems with the JSL GMs where they were, in a lot of cases, people that weren't going to contribute to your development. And many of those GMs were people that were going to be players in the JSL, and they were just GMing almost to guarantee themselves a starting
Ice
spot and kind
time.
of build
Yeah.
a team
Because you had
around
to
them.
play everybody, right?
Exactly.
So
You
if
had
you
to play
GM,
everybody that showed up.
you
So,
can
and
play
then you'd
yourself.
get to the point of, there were teams that would, draft their starting five or whatever, and then, get a backup or two, and then they draft a bunch of people they knew wouldn't show up so that they wouldn't have to split ice time with other people. So, there was a lot of elements to the JSL that wound up being kind of exploited and taken advantage
Yeah.
of. And
And not that there shouldn't be even a third league with as many players as we had at one point there.
yeah,
Like we talk about with pub stars and nub stars. Like there are tiers of this game, and low end players shouldn't be playing with the high end players. And
so
yeah,
So when I proposed the JSL, it was meant to be something that existed only as long as we needed it to. And the point was that we'd have a recruitment every year around the summertime. We'd usually do it right after the end of the NHL finals, like between then and the start of free agency, because that's when everybody's like, looking at the rumors of who's going to be leaving in free agency, who's signing where, looking at all the postseason stuff, like, oh, these players played with all these injuries. Oh, look at hear all the NHL awards, right? We tried to take advantage of that time on the subreddit to say, look, if you're looking for more hockey to fill that void until September hits and there's preseason games, like take a look at this game. So we'd try to do that. Then we would have a new player tournament right afterwards to try to keep them and get them used to the concept of having a team to play with and showing up to play games at a scheduled time. And then we'd run a JSL. We'd have like 2 to 3 seasons. And then that would be that. We'd cut it off, just the RSL and the LHL until there's a new recruitment the following year.
Hmm.
So that was the logic that was kind of supposed to happen. Unfortunately, it never really worked out that way, and everybody got way too complacent with it. And that starts at the top with the people that were responsible with it at BOC didn't do a good enough job, and the people that were GMing didn't do a good enough job, and the players that played in it were lazy and didn't care enough. And that's a generalization. Obviously, they don't all fall under that bucket, but by the end of the JSL, the majority of the players that were playing in there were exactly who I was just telling you about. Lazy,
Yeah,
unmotivated, didn't care enough, and just assumed that they would get better by playing and were just trying to guarantee themselves ice time. I'm sorry, but we don't need to see Keller in the JSL for 7 seasons.
yeah. And like the Rising Hippo and other players who just would always be there and
Yep,
have been around as long as I had.
every single season. Yep.
Yeah, like there were players in the JSL that have been playing longer than me, and that was always just I never liked seeing that. I always felt like they should just if you've been playing that long and you're playing with the new-ish guys, mostly new guys for a good chunk of those rosters, that you should just be an RSL backup at that point.
Hmm.
It's play pubs, play whatever, but like don't take away ice time from the new guys. Oh well. Too late to do anything about it now. The sad thing about that too is we talk about players in the RSL having a hard time developing. Players in the JSL, the only players who and there were players who played in the JSL and went on to be LHLers, prolific players even, but they got better on their own. Like the JSL had nothing to do with their improvement. If anything, it was probably a hindrance on it.
Yeah, I
Of
mean,
so,
the
yeah, like
most egregious examples are like Guy and Drag, right?
yeah. Well, they started in the RSL and then the JSL came around and they went there and they were too good for it at that, especially Guy. Guy absolutely demolished it. Guy was in playing in the LHL finals and the JSL finals at the same time. It, it's insane, and that's exactly the point of Guy Lavore. Despite playing in the JSL, was never at any point a JSL player. He never needed the JSL, and it provided nothing for him.
Yeah.
He was a high-end RSLer already, or a starting level RSLer who just was drafted late. And that's kind of the case with a few players that played there. I mean, some of them would cut brand new guys, like I think Kill started there, came in and dominated, and then he just goes up to the RSL immediately. Like these guys were getting better on their own, and just the JSL was
So,
just a place for them to waste a season, pretty much.
yeah. So, do you think there are any players that did benefit from the JSL that started there?
Maybe early, maybe the first season scene. Like Sully's a guy you brought up to me right before, pointing out you asked if he was, and I remember because I was on his affiliated RSL team, and he definitely was putting in the work and he treated it seriously. And I think it was good when it was affiliated that season, and the GM sort of cared a little more. The fairy, and then after that, like once the affiliation was lost, I think there wasn't a lot of good coming out of the JSL.
So
Once there
you
was
you think you think
nothing
the
coming from the top.
affiliation was better than the
I think it was, yeah.
non-affiliation?
I think it could have worked better without affiliation too. Like, I mean, there's a million things you could have done with the JSL that would have made it better, like limiting the number of seasons or like doing what it was initially supposed to be, which is come back every time there's a recruitment. But yeah, there needed to be a higher presence. Somebody needed to be helping these new guys and trying to push them. Like, I wonder how many new guys were never told to practice on their own. like we talk about it now, like you have to put in the effort. I wonder if how many guys found this game, tried to play in the JSL and like left immediately because it
Yeah.
was a mess, and how many guys you lose just because you don't tell them, hey, like these aren't where you get better. This is just this is kind of where you learn team play. It helps you, it prepares you maybe for playing in a league structure, but it doesn't help you improve.
Yeah.
That's kind of the value that they provided
And
for
of
the
the
RSL
other
and JSL.
the other names I'm seeing here that are in some of the early seasons of the JSL anyway, or you know, there's not really many superstars, but you at least have like Haybert was there for a little bit, Big Bertha, Canoodle,
Hmm.
Doug, Ike,
Yeah,
Sir
and there's good
Gregors, I
players. Yeah,
think, Cock, Icy, Juice is another one. He's probably the biggest one.
yeah,
KP, you mentioned, Lewis Friend,
yeah,
Paco as well, who
yeah. A lot.
Paco never really hit his stride until the LHL was ending, so he unfortunately kind of misses out on that. But there's also, I think, Rezi as well got his start in the RSL.
The JSL.
Or sorry, the JSL. But like you
Yeah,
said, I think in pretty much all of those cases, those were all players who had innate talent anyway, that even without the
yeah,
JSL would have carried them to a starting spot in the RSL pretty quickly if that's where they had to start.
yep,
So I definitely agree with you where I would say I don't really think that there's a like any one player I can name and say the JSL was good for that guy.
yeah. I think it's something in common with pretty much every player you listed there is a really good set of hands,
Hmm.
and that's what carried almost all of them right through, right up. Those guys who made the LHL and played games was they had talent, and they just those aren't things that you gain playing in the JSL and playing in leagues. Those are
People that
you
had
know
good like hand-eye
yeah,
coordination coming in. Yeah.
good hand-eye, good stick handling, and like you get that practicing, you get that putting in the effort. It's just even more. It's just the JSL playing 15 minutes against brand new guys and horrible, some of the worst players, veteran players the game had ever saw. That's not that's not a good way to develop, even as a new guy. You don't teach much, but they put in the work. All of them there, Ike and Juice and Rezi, to varying degrees of success.
Yeah.
Juice is right now like probably the best player in the game. He's unreal. He's absolutely unbelievable. And the JSL, you might have I don't know how long he played there, but I know he doesn't look back on those JSL times too fondly. Like he doesn't I don't think he gained anything from it, honestly.
Yeah.
I don't know. RSL I think was better, honestly, for developing than LHL because at least you're playing with better guys. A lot of those guys had played in the LHL. You could learn things from a teammate every now and then, even if it wasn't the league wasn't set up great to do it. There was something there. The JSL, all the leadership from the GMs, because it was all about fucking around and just yeah, it's just an upsetting. It's a really disappointing
Disappointing, I think, is the
saga.
best way to word it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a waste. Just a sad waste.
What could have been?
What could have been. Anyway, you'll be happy to know the JSL is coming back. That's the new league. We're all going
uh,
back. Everybody who didn't get their triple or quadruple crowns can go back for it.
okay. So with that said, I think we touched on most of the things that we wanted to coming in. So any final things you wanted to touch on or closing
In
thoughts
the
here?
JSL or anything.
Or just anything at this point? Yeah.
Anything. One thing I thought about, because it's hard for me to talk about other people's development. There's a couple players though that if we talk about development, I don't even know. Just like Kiwi and Marchi spring to mind as people we talked about. Couldn't believe they kind of turned it around, and they didn't. Neither of those guys turned it around with their play, even though they did play a while in the RSL. It was position switching. Immediately did it for a lot of play. Marchi switching from forward to D and was immediately one best D in the LHL, and he won it a few times, I think. And Kiwi switched to goalie and was immediately the best goalie in the LHL. It's just I don't know. It's a super interesting thing of not many players really I think developed and honed their skills Like there's or in the league setting at least, it was a lot of they played for a while and they found a position or a play style that worked.
It
It's just
does it does make you wonder how many players could have made a position switch and been really good or been, good earlier,
yep,
that didn't, right? That's
yeah.
definitely an interesting thing to speculate on.
Yeah, you know what I thought of my own struggle because we talked about I sort of was a high scorer in the RSL early on, and then I stagnated and I kind of went down like a lower end top performer. Even though sort of bounced back in my last season a little, but I think what honestly helped me a lot, if we're talking about development, is I was playing as a second forward a lot. That's how I wanted to play, even in the RSL in season 9 and 10, like my last ones there. And I think just it's really odd. I think there's probably not a whole lot of instances of a second R like the second option in the RSL jumping up into the LHL as a forward.
Yeah.
It's just it's a very weird thing. I wonder how many people, if they limited themselves and tried to play a little more like me, like better players, try to play kind of a simpler game, if it would have worked out for them.
No, I definitely agree. I think there are a number of people that could have benefited a lot from trying a bit more to play that play style.
Yeah, even if it means you sacrifice points,
Yeah.
like it was all about points for so many of them that if you focus on your passing and your back checking a little better, like you could
Well, it's kind
jump
of
into the
that's kind of the
LHL.
thing, right? You have
Yeah.
to get into the LHL first before you can start scoring a bunch of points there, and that means learning how to be, in most cases, learning how to be more of a complete player, right? Unless
Hmm.
you're, super fucking good at defense or super fucking good at offense or something,
Yep.
you generally needed to have more of a complete game to be able to move up. And yeah, a lot of people didn't focus on doing that. So they were more concerned in a lot of cases about, like, oh, I want to lead the RSL in points, and not I want to be the best forward in the RSL, or I,
Hmm.
I want to prepare myself for the LHL is probably a better way to word it, right? I
Yeah.
want to make myself the best
Which is
potential
something, yeah,
LHL player I could be.
Guy probably was doing. He was, he
Yeah.
like he was a scorer, but he was, we worked on his whole game in the RSL. He's a really good, and then he jumped up as a second forward. And he's probably the best second forward to ever play the game.
I mean,
That's
I
just
think
sort of his
I
style.
think he's good enough to be a primary forward
No,
too.
he is.
So,
I'm just saying that's what he like. His style though for
oh,
his
I agree.
LHL career was
Yeah.
just suited to being a second forward, and
Yep.
he was better than a lot of first forwards though, just all around talent wise.
Well, that's the thing. He made it work.
Yeah.
He made it work,
I
and
wasn't I wasn't that good, but I squeezed my way in, weaseled my way into
well,
the league
you
and
know,
didn't let go.
you stuck your stick out in front of those crab shots, and
Yeah.
he was putting
And
them in
boy,
off your twig.
yep, they just went off my stick into the net, and then I was one of the top scorers of all time in career 5v5. It's good stuff. It was
It's the
really
way to
easy.
do it.
You really didn't need talent to be a successful LHL player, as I proved. Think about the talented players. Think about how many good
Yeah, I
LHLers could
mean,
have
you
been
were you were
if they just
14th
focused.
all time in 5v5
I think
points.
I'm a 10th in playoff scoring too.
Yeah, that's just regular season, and
Yeah.
then playoff scoring, you're 8th
Oh,
all
eighth.
time.
Yeah. Look at that. Look at that, people. Just play a little D.
Which,
The points
looking
come.
looking in playoff scoring too, if we're gonna take a peek at the top 8, right, including you, 3 of the top 8 people are secondary forwards, and one of them is a defenseman. You had
Yep. And
myself,
I played a lot of
Otto,
D.
Lucic, and Gabe as goal scorers. And you had you, Cap, and Crab as
Yeah.
supporting forwards. And then you had
Well,
Taze as a
I only had
defenseman.
two of my 6 finals runs and my whatever how many seasons and 7 I think trips that I played 8 seasons, 7 playoffs, 6 finals. I only played forward in 2 of them.
I mean,
So
so
like
it's
that's
just furthers the point though, right? I mean, you go down to 9, 9 is BG, and
no,
it's
yep.
not until you get down to the 10th person at Dick McButts where you get another carry forward.
You're
So
telling me and BG had more playoff points than
yeah,
DMD?
yeah.
That's awesome.
So of the top 10 playoff performers, you're looking at 5 offensive carries, and the other 5 are defensemen and secondary forwards. So you don't have to be an elite superstar, forward goal scorer to be one of the better point producers over the course of time. Because if you're willing to be a good secondary defenseman or a good primary defenseman or a good secondary forward, you can set yourself up really well to be on a successful team. And if you go look at a lot of those the big seasons from guys like Otto and Lucic and whatnot, a lot of the times they performed their best when the secondary players around them were really good and did a lot to support them. It's very obvious that that's the case. There's a clear correlation in that every single time. And that's exactly what, these people we're talking about could have been or could have done and set themselves up to be successful in that way, right? Like if you're willing to be a good secondary forward, you can make your primary forward better, which makes you look better by association, right? It's sort of like a rising tide lifts all ships, right? Be the rising tide. Don't sit there and try to be the guy at the top when you can't match that yet.
Yeah, if
So
you can't compete, if you can't score like Dial and Otto, don't do something else. There are many ways to help a team, not just and like you could try to again. You can't compete with Dial and Otto scoring. Don't try to do that. And I don't know. It's an odd mentality people had in this game.
agreed.
Probably benefits towards or not benefits, but probably directly related to the toxic behavior of a lot of people in the community as it went on. A lot of shitheads are selfish and
Yeah, I was gonna say a lot
all
of
that.
lot of selfishness, a lot of self-interest, and a lot of not caring as much about how the team does as caring about how you look and how good
Hmm.
you do and how many points you score. And I think the players in general, LHL included, RSL and JSL, right? The players that were willing to look past their own individual performance and try to play towards having a good team, those are the ones who had successful careers in
Yeah,
most cases. So
yeah. A lot of, and it's funny you talk about me and PG. Two guys came in through the RSL and played a handful of seasons there, and then jumped into these secondary roles and found success.
I mean, if you go look at
It's
the
funny.
regular season, just to do the exact same thing we did for the playoffs, I'll look at the top 15 since you're 14, and guess what? 15 is BG again, right behind you.
Oh yeah.
But of the top 15, you have myself, Otto, Lucic, Gabe, DMB, and Dildozer. Those are the
I
only
think they
six
were all on my
players.
list.
Those are the only 6 players I would describe as like typically number one forwards on their team.
Yep.
In addition to those names, you have Crab, Cap,
Yep.
Guy, Taze, Leafs, Tall, Dalthan, Tony, and BG.
There's a whole lot of secondary guys in there.
9 of them.
Yeah.
Of the
And
top
guys who came through
15,
the RSL, Cap and
exactly.
Tall and me and
Uh,
Guy and BG.
even
Leafs.
Gabe. Gabe got his start in the RSL. That's where he played first. So anyway, of the top 15, you've got 6 that are primary number one forwards, and the other 9 are defensemen and secondary forwards. I mean, like
Yep.
it speaks for itself to that point. So anyway, okay, I think we've touched this or touched on everything. We've covered
Yeah,
this.
we touched on ourselves enough for one day.
Yes. Yep. All right, so we'll end it here. Um, we're gonna keep working on getting 2 out every week. By now, we've really worked out the Monday Thursday schedule. Is what we think we're gonna be going with for the at least the
Unless this
foreseeable
doesn't come out on
future.
one of those days.
It it very likely will.
It should.
Very likely will. I would be surprised if it doesn't. But anyway, we are gonna keep trying to do them. Is it bi-weekly? Is like every other week, right?
Yeah, this is like
So it's just twice a week. Is there a word for that?
yeah.
I
I'm
don't
sure
think
there
there
is, but
is.
I'm an idiot. I'm only an HQM lore expert.
True. Same.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. So yeah, keep expecting these twice a week. We will do our best to keep fulfilling that. It's been a lot of fun so far, as
Submit
usual.
questions.
Yep, as usual. Any feedback you guys have, any questions or topics that you want us to touch on, please, we're always, welcome to address any of that and spend an hour and a half answering your question because we can absolutely do that. So, yeah, give us a shout on Discord, wherever. If you have anything, YouTube comments as well. Hello, Lewis. Anyway, beyond that, thank you very much, Tony, for being here tonight, and we will see you guys later.
See you.